The years 1665 and 1666 hold a significant place in the history of England. These 2 years are marked by one of the deadliest pandemics the world has ever seen. A mysterious and deadly disease spread rapidly throughout the capital city of London, and the effects were catastrophic. The people of London began to notice strange black marks appearing on their bodies, followed by severe coughing and blood coming from their mouths. Within just a few days, the individuals infected with the disease would tragically succumb to it. In a matter of only 2 years, this devastating plague claimed the lives of approximately 100,000 people in London. To put this in perspective, this was about a quarter of London's entire population at the time. During this period, medical science was far from what it is today. There were no advanced treatments, and doctors had very little understanding of what was actually happening to the people. It was a time of confusion and terror as the medical community struggled to find answers. Imagine, in just a span of 2 years, 100,000 people lost their lives in one city. It was a devastating time for London, and this event is now referred to as the Great Plague of London. The plague was primarily spread by rats, which were rampant in London at the time. These rats carried a deadly bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. When a rat bit a person, the bacteria would transfer into the human body, spreading through the lungs and bloodstream. Within days, the infected person would die, often in a matter of just a few days. The most frightening part was that this bacteria could spread not only through direct contact with infected animals, but also from one person to another. This rapid transmission caused the death toll to rise at an alarming rate. At the time, London had no proper sanitation systems. Many parts of the city were filthy, and people lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. These conditions were ideal for rats to thrive in, which allowed them to spread the disease quickly. It wasn't just the rats that were spreading the plague. The lack of understanding of hygiene and disease transmission meant that the plague was able to spread like wildfire. People didn't know how to protect themselves, and the authorities were completely overwhelmed. Doctors at the time were baffled by the disease. They didn't understand how it spread or how to treat it, and they didn't even know what caused it. The lack of medical knowledge made the situation even worse. They couldn't control the outbreak or even properly identify it. Much like how the world dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic centuries later, people were living in fear and uncertainty. The difference, however, was that 350 years ago, no one had the scientific knowledge or technology to provide answers or solutions to the crisis. In the midst of the plague, many of the wealthy and powerful individuals of London fled the city to escape the disease. They could afford to leave, and they sought refuge in the countryside, hoping to avoid the plague. But for the poor who had no means of escape, the situation was much worse. They were stuck in the city, and there was little they could do to protect themselves from the spreading disease. At the same time, trade with other parts of Britain and Europe was severely impacted. Anyone who contracted the disease was confined to their homes in quarantine, which meant that trade and movement were halted. Even the pets of Londoners, such as cats and dogs, were killed because authorities suspected that they were contributing to the spread of the disease. Cats in particular were seen as a danger because they preyed on the rats that were carrying the plague. As the disease raged on, doctors took extreme measures to protect themselves from becoming infected. They began wearing strange protective outfits, which included long coats, masks, and hoods. The masks were equipped with a long, curved beak that was filled with herbs and spices. The idea behind this was that the bad smells of the plague could be avoided by inhaling these herbs, which were believed to purify the air. It was a primitive form of protection, and while it may have offered some psychological comfort, it did little to stop the spread of the disease. Every week, thousands of people were dying, and the authorities faced a new crisis. How could they dispose of all the bodies? The sheer number of bodies was overwhelming, and they had to find a way to bury them quickly. Initially, the bodies were buried in churchyards, but these spaces quickly became overcrowded. Eventually, mass graves were dug across various parts of the city, and the dead were hastily buried in these pits. The situation was so dire that thousands of bodies were interred in fields outside the city, and many people were buried without ceremony or proper rites. Even today, beneath the streets of London, there are thousands of bodies buried from that time. These mass graves are a haunting reminder of the scale of the tragedy that unfolded. Over time, London expanded, and construction projects took place over the areas where the bodies were buried. As a result, the exact locations of these mass graves remain largely unknown. However, in some areas of London, signs still exist indicating that human remains lie buried beneath. One of the most notable discoveries happened during the construction of the Elizabeth Line, a new railway line in London. During excavation, workers uncovered the remains of over 4,000 people. This discovery provides a chilling glimpse into the scale of the plague and the people who lived and died during that time. Today, even though 350 years have passed, parts of London still bear witness to the plague's tragic legacy. The remains of those who perished during the Great Plague are still present under the city's streets, buried in forgotten corners of the urban landscape. These remains, along with the historical accounts, serve as a poignant reminder of the horrific toll the plague took on London and the deep scars it left on the city and its people.